Welcome to TFR Let's Talk. I'm your host, Swapnil Bhartiya, and my next guest is once again Sandall, VP of Open Source at Styra. Torian, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, Swapnil, thanks for having me back.
We all know what Styra as you folks provide policy as code solutions to make things easier for security, compliance, and a lot of other things. We have talked to Styra so many times, but today we are going to focus mostly on what are the benefits of using policy as code. Now, I do know, Styra, you have your own vested interest in this topic, but I would like to approach this topic from purely vendor neutral community ecosystem and looking at a problems perspective. So let's start there. Talk a bit about why organizations, companies should care about implementing or having a policy as code strategy.
Yeah, so I think that there's still confusion in the space about what policy as code means, right? And if you just look at it from a vendor neutral or a vendor agnostic way, I think the best way to understand it is it's the idea of taking software engineering best practices and applying them to policy and authorization and the controls that govern who can do what or what can do what inside of your systems. Right. So I think we've learned a lot from, software engineering over the past, few decades. And there's a lot that can be applied to how we manage, large scale systems in enterprises, large organizations securely. Right. So these are ideas like using things like version control and code review and testing and so on in order to improve our security posture. So that's kind of what policy as code is. Why it's important. It has to do with where these systems are going and how they're being developed and how they're being operated. Right, we're getting to the point where it's not possible to manage policy and authorization security manually anymore. The old approach of writing down kind of rules and so on a wiki or tracking them in a spreadsheet or putting them in a PDF and sending them across in an email to another department and then hoping that they get enforced and set up correctly simply doesn't work anymore. It doesn't scale anymore. It can't keep up with the dynamic nature of modern cloud native environments. And it has a really difficult time keeping up with the heterogeneity, all the different options that developers have access to when they're making technical decisions in the implementation of systems these days. And so really, the trends call for a new way of managing policy and authorization in large organizations.
Styra is also, you folks are involved with OPA, Open Policy Agent. I want to also understand, we have talked about this, especially with you also, but I want to understand or just kind of reinforce the view, which will more or less, like you have already touched upon that, is that last year we saw a kind of massive traffic towards where companies were rushing towards cloud native or digital transformation because of pandemic. They were rushing into it, and a lot of time it was more or less like, hey, just get on the cloud. It was not well strategically planned. How do you see those companies are now looking at policy as a code, especially when they are using not only different cloud providers that sometimes that is accidental, right? Because somebody in the team wanted to use something from AWS versus somebody wanted to use something from Azure versus GCP. So talk about the sudden growing importance and need of policy as a code or OPAL. So if you can bring that in this change landscape.
For sure, yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head. One of the great things about the space right now is that as a developer, you have so many different options for what tools you want to make use of inside of your development environments, inside of your deployment environments, and so on, right? And so that's great from the developer's point of view because they can experiment with the right tool for the job. And it's great from the business's point of view because it allows them to move quickly, right? They can get applications up and running in whatever environment best suits the application, and they can have that thing rolled out as quickly as possible, right? And so they're delivering value to the business very quickly. But the risk there, obviously, is that you might not have all the controls in place that you need in those more modern environments, right? When you start handing over control of compute, network, and storage resources to a wide range of people, and they're no longer being managed by a core group of operations staff that know how to set everything just right, you open yourself up to a lot of risk, right? It's very easy for somebody to accidentally misconfigure a load balancer or a workload or a piece of storage or something like that in such a way that compromises the firm's security posture, or impacts availability or performance or cost. So there's a number of ways that these kind of misconfigurations can creep in. And the misconfigurations are always technology specific, right? Like you can misconfigure Kubernetes in a way that impacts you negatively. You can misconfigure your public cloud, whether it's AWS or GCP or Azure or what have you. And so in order to prevent those kind of mistakes from literally bringing down the business, you need to have a way of kind of automatically, or you need to have a way of defining and then automatically enforcing policies over this wide range of different kinds of resources, right? Even though Kubernetes is managing compute network and storage resources, and you're using Terraform to manage compute network and storage in your AWS accounts, those are very, they're similar, but they're also very different. And so you need a tool that's able to understand and reason about those different shapes of resources in those different environments. And so that's really what OPA brings to the table. OPA, or Open Policy Agent, is basically like a building block. It's really meant to be this kind of like low-level tool that you can use to express and codify policies in a portable, vendor-agnostic way, which you can then apply across all these different environments, whether you're talking about Kubernetes or Terraform or CloudFormation or Azure resource templates and so on, right? So you can basically use OPA to express policy in a way that is guaranteed to work across all these different kinds of environments, and will scale, basically.
You mentioned some. I also want to talk quickly about when we do look at security, a lot of reports are coming out that organizations are under constant attack. Ransomware, as you see, it's rise, and it's becoming more sophisticated. The thing is that cyber war, we will not need traditional warfare. They can bring down the whole grid. They can bring gas. They shut down. We live in East Coast, and I actually experienced myself that all the gas stations were dried up. So people would panic. Then the Brazilian, the food packaging, of meat packaging. So you don't need traditional warfare. Now with security, as you know very well, it could either be bugs or what you mentioned was misconfiguration. In most cases, human errors are the cause of that. So can you also talk about the risks that are there by not having a policy as a code or any strategy like that? Because when you look at security, it's not easy. You flip the button and it's done. We can talk about observability. We can talk about polymorphing. We can talk about so many things. It's a complicated space. So talk about the role of policy as a code. How much risk, how much it helps in reducing the risk, and why companies should have it so that they can at least take care of some risk. You can never have a fully secure implementation ever.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that, if you look at how security controls have been implemented historically, right, you would have, a set of requirements, and you would go off and you'd configure the system manually, basically, to implement those controls. And that works for now, for the threats that you know about, right? But what happens when those threats evolve? What happens when those requirements change, right? Then the controls that you've implemented are out of date. And that's where you can get caught. And of course, you can audit and you can monitor and you can remediate, but that's after the fact, right? So the idea behind policy as code is to kind of shift. It's this idea of kind of shifting left, right? Of taking these security controls and baking them into the development process so that you're thinking about security from the start, and so that your developers are thinking about it and that they're educated on it and that they have the right tools in place that meet their requirements in order to enforce policy more strictly, right? And then with something like OPA, because it's intended to operate in this kind of like cloud native environment, your policies can basically follow your workloads around, right? So your policies are no longer these centralized network-based, perimeter rules. They can be kind of very lightweight modules that are basically deployed next to the application, next to the software that needs to make decisions and needs to enforce important security rules. So that's one of the things that we see, people picking up OPA for, is having this ability to create, small packages of rules, of policies, and then deploy them next to the applications, like on the same machine, and have them enforced locally, so that they can follow the application around as it moves in these kind of very dynamic environments, and then it can be updated on the fly in order to keep up with, threats, basically.
Can you also talk about, of course, Kubernetes is the big elephant in the room. We have to talk about it. And container usage is also growing. We are containerizing a lot of things. Containers bring a lot of challenges with themselves. Sometimes people don't even know what things are there in their container. They just pull the image from some public. You don't know what the hardlinks there can be compliant issues because the code that is in there may not be compliant with the code that you're using somewhere else. So can you also talk about how policy as a code kind of mitigates some of those risks? Because cloud native is already complicated, and we should not add more complexity to that. We should make things simpler.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that Kubernetes does really well is that it helps break down the silos that used to exist when it came to managing infrastructure resources, right? So in the past, the resources that made up, or the compute resources that made up a workload, were pretty much siloed off from the network resources and the storage resources, right? They were managed by different teams using different technologies, they had different interfaces, and so on. With Kubernetes, that goes away a little bit because it provides a unified way of describing those resources, and it provides a single API to manage them via. And so that's really useful from a policy perspective because it gives us a single place where we can enforce those guardrails inside of the environments before issues make it into production, right? So that's one of the things that's great about Kubernetes. I think that another aspect, obviously, around containers that we're seeing recently are a lot of developments that improve the sort of the security posture with respect to the supply chain, right? It's very difficult today, at least, to attest to the integrity of the software that you're deploying sometimes, and especially when you start looking at the dependencies of your software and the dependencies of those dependencies, and it's a transitive problem, right? And so we're seeing a lot of excitement around potential solutions for that right now. So I think that the state of things is improving, but there's still a long way to go.
If I ask you, as you're talking about it earlier, there are a lot of companies rushed to the cloud, or they're still rushing. Of course, I will not ask you to share the whole playbook, but if you have some kind of tips or 5 steps, this is how you should approach, or this is how you should build your policy strategy, or the whole implementation there, what would that be?
Yeah, so we generally recommend that people basically follow like a 3-step process of crawl, walk, run, right? And so that's where we see people be most successful, is when they have some sort of concrete problem that they can identify, where they see policy as being a key piece of that. And what we recommend people do is take a look at Open Policy Agent and see how it could maybe map to your problem space, because often it can, and often it provides a very good solution. And then once you've built up some confidence around Open Policy Agent for that problem space, you'll probably start to see other areas where it can be applied, and then it tends to sort of spread across the stack. So that we typically recommend that people kind of follow like a gradual kind of adoption path when it comes to policy as code, and OPA really enables that. I think that what we see a lot is that as organizations are going through this digital transformation process of taking monoliths and splitting them up into microservices and taking advantage of new kinds of platforms, one of the first problems that they need to solve for is policy or authorization, basically, right? Because in the past, you didn't really need to worry about authorization as much. Everything was running in one large monolith on a set of servers that you could just draw a perimeter around at the network level and be done with it. But that's not really the case anymore, right? You've got a variety. You've got hundreds of teams potentially operating hundreds of services that are written in different languages, that are running in different locations, that are speaking different protocols, that are using different identity formats, and so the old ways of enforcing policy around those services just doesn't really work anymore. And so you need a new approach. And that's really what we designed Open Policy Agent for in the beginning, was to really support this sort of modern diverse, heterogeneous environment.
Torian, once again, thank you so much for taking time out and share your insights about the importance of having policy as a code strategy or implementation there. And I would love to have you back on the show. And I hope that we can start doing these things in person as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Swapnil. Take care. Bye bye.